All right. Just one more thing about the nature of intentionality and phenomenology. Husserl is the place to go here, but again, I mean, not again. I don't know if I've said this here. Uh, Perhaps the best place to understand this, at least as regards organisms like living things, is Merleau-Ponty. The Structure of Behavior is a great book in this regard. The Phenomenology of Perception is also a fine book for this, but the Phenomenology of Perception is about human perceptual engagement, where the structure of behavior is about how animals have this sort of unified world. And boy, oh boy, when I say animals, Merleau-Ponty goes from like Hydra, like a sea anemone, I mean, like that kind of organism, to spiders, to goldfish, to monkeys, to cats, to I mean, he just goes through fish, other kinds of fish. I mean, just like there's he tries to understand this from like the most simple, rudimentary sort of organisms, certainly ones that we wouldn't say are conscious, like expressly conscious of their world. But so Merleau-Ponty understands intentionality. Edmund Husserl understands intentionality as like all consciousness is consciousness of. So he understands it in terms of consciousness, right? And that's a problematic word, especially if that means like the ghost in the machine. If consciousness means something like a, a, like an attentive engagement, then it might mean something else. And an attentive engagement is what intentionality is, then that sea anemone, and this is Merleau-Ponty's example, always it can only live when it's in a certain orientation, up, right? So it will latch onto something, some rock or something like that, some structure, so that it can maintain its upness, right? And if you take that structure that it is latched onto and you flip it upside down, so that now the thing is upside down, it will turn around and make itself oriented up again. And if you flip it again, it will turn itself around and make itself oriented up again. And if you flip it again, it'll leave. That is to say, it wants a. Well, here's the thing. We don't want to start saying, here's what a sea anemone wants or something like that, because like the sea anemones over there saying, hey, these are my preferences and I have this and this. It's not about like an expressed consciousness. And Merleau-Ponty's sure to capture this. He says something like, everything happens in the sea anemone's world as if up has a meaning, right? And this is how he talks about everything happens in the this animal or that animal's world as if there is some sort of orientation, and there are more or less complex orientations, right? So what this means is that intentionality, understood in this sense, is a power into the world, right? A power into the world. The sea anemone's power into the world is like latching and up. So it's not a very complex one. An amoeba might do something, a spider might do something else. Animals do have other kinds of powers into the world, and so do we as humans. What's important about this and why this is so like contrary to science, the scientific point of view, and why science will never understand human behavior, is because science understands us as passive, right? I am a data collecting thing, and anything that I do is in response to data. So I am, if anything, any of my engagements with the world are reactions from the point of view of science, and there is no like empowerment to be understood from the point of view of the scientist. Because if we were to do that, we would have to name that empowerment. And if we were to name that empowerment, what's it going to be? Soul or something like that, right? And the scientist can't measure those things, so the scientist says those things don't exist. So I mean, it's easy. That's good work if you can get it, but it's also dishonest work, I'd have to say, because the scientist participates in a world that he or she would therefore deny, right? I turn to a world and ask it a question. From the point of view of the scientist, no biological entity could ever do that because we're passive. A question is an active engagement. What's going on here? Response is thing, right? So we are powers into the world, and we need to be understood that way. And for humans, that is an embodied power into the world, and not just a conscious power, right? So my world is splayed out in front of me according to my bodily orientation, and my body's a power into the world. So the world is carved up according to my bodily power. Like, what's reachable? What's navigable? Can I walk through those trees? Nope. Can I walk around them? Sure can. Have you ever stood on the side of a path, like, and looked into the woods? You know, there's the path on the one side, and that's like an easy walk, and the woods, well, not an easy walk. But then even in the woods, there's sort of like a quasi path that shows itself, a place where you could go. You know, this is too thick to walk through. That's a cliff. You'll fall off it and die. These are trees you can't walk through, but there's like this sort of space here you could go through. That doesn't show up as a series of judgments of assessment about the nature of the trees and everything that's in front of me, like some data processing machine. It shows up as the means of my body to go into the world, right? It is there that the world is oriented according to my empowerment. What I can do, where I can go, what I can reach, the things I can move. So, one of the things here is like Nietzsche's will to power, the fact that there is something about me that enters the world in a way that makes meaning of the world. This is what's showing up here. The French word sens, it means sense, like meaning, but also direction. So I think that's a telling word here. The sense of the world is a direction of the world and a meaning of the world. So this is just to get some sense about what phenomenology might have in mind. There's a whole lot more to be said, but I want to turn to Heidegger now, and we can sort of fill in the blanks going backwards if we need to. Okay? All right, so I'm going to start talking about Heidegger now. We've put him in context a little bit. One can put him in context more and more, but, let's get to the man. So, his dates are 1889 to 1976, one of the most contemporary that we've read so far in this class. And he's a German, lived through the first, well, I guess both World Wars, but was the Second World War, where Germany was the Nazis, of infamy. That was his Germany, and he wanted to be the official philosopher of the Nazi Party. So now, one doesn't want to make excuses for somebody's Nazism, but not all Nazis are the Naziest. Can I say that? I guess I did. So, I don't know. First, there's two things. One can look through his philosophy from Being in Time to the last work and try to find some sort of anti-Semitic anything, and one would have a very, very, very hard time. Believe me, everyone's done it, or a lot of people have. Heidegger was so influential and a Nazi that, how were the two connected had to be asked, and continuously is asked, and it's you can't get his anti-Semitism from his philosophy. You can't go from his philosophy to anti-Semitism. There's nothing in Heidegger that like there is in Nietzsche, where it's the Jews, slave revolt of the Jews, whatever. Like where one could say, even if it's wrong to say so in Nietzsche, there's not even the opportunity to find something like that in Heidegger. He doesn't have it, you know. But he was a Nazi, and like I said, he wanted to be the official philosopher of the Nazi Party. You know, if we can, aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? You know, there's that joke. You know, aside from your husband getting shot, you know, aside from the Holocaust, what were the Nazis about? You know, let's try that for a moment. You know, there's this like the the Volk, right? The people, and you know, I think that might be something that we have for those of us who are Americans. You know, there is something about the American spirit or something like that, the American ingenuity. You know, if there's a problem to be solved, an American can do it for sure. I mean, maybe we will do it anyway because we're like that kind of people. That's us, right? And that sort of celebration of the spirit of the people, that's something that the Nazis had. So, you know, there's that might be problematic as regards like a nationalism and just a selfish orientation. But, you know, it's not in itself evil, right? It was certainly it was fueled by an anti-Semitism, but like a national pride or pride in the spirit of the people and of the fatherland. You know, the fatherland in Germany, and in English, our word for the same thing is patriot, right? Patri is father. Fatherland sounds like Nazi, and patriot sounds like, you know, sparklers on the 4th of July. But it's the same sort of thing. It is a reverence for our history and the courageous and the creative people that have brought us to here. And, you know, gee willikers, and boy, oh boy, it's some of the stuff that one might find in Nazi political orientations are not in themselves evil. I feel a little weird saying that, but you know, there's some things that if you could see them separate from the Nazis, you'd be like, yeah, okay, I could see myself being for that. But then, of course, there's always just the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, which just can't get and shouldn't be set aside. But there's nothing like seeing, you know, it wasn't like Heidegger wanted to be the philosopher of the Nazi Party so that he could, you know, get in there and use his philosophy to show why the Jews needed to be exterminated or whatever. It's just not it. It's just not it. Okay, so how do we know he was a Nazi then if none of his Nazi stuff is in his writing? Well, he also did things. So his teacher was Husserl, and for the longest time I had heard that Heidegger was given Husserl's job and then so fired Husserl. Evidently, it's not quite like that. Husserl ended up being no longer able to have his job because he was a Jew, and Heidegger got his job because he wasn't a Jew. And he was also Heidegger, a very famous philosopher. So it was more like a matter of circumstance and not a matter of the active firing of his own teacher kind of thing. But, you know, he certainly wouldn't have any Jews in his class. He wouldn't have any Jewish graduate students. You know, he had other things in his life that would distance him from the Jews, right? So, yeah, he did things like that. So even if he didn't fire his teacher, you know, he might have. Then there's these notebooks. After he died, some years after he died, his estate put out his private notebooks and stuff like that, where he's like notes to himself, and there, yeah, one can see his anti-Semitism expressly. You know, he's one thing he says is this, especially about this guy Husserl, who was like this wicked smart guy and Heidegger's teacher for a while. You know, it's like he says something like whether or not Husserl would have ever been able to understand the true depths of philosophy is made questionable because he's a Jew. He says it something like that. It's not a direct quote, but something about Husserl's Jewishness meant that he wasn't going to be able to be a real philosopher, even if he had some good things going on. And so he says stuff like this. It's just like, so what do I do with that? How do I, I don't know. Here's what I think. There's stuff to be found in the ideas that are Heidegger's. Let's look to the ideas that are Heidegger's. If Heidegger was a dick or, whatever else, then he was. But they're the ideas that he has, and maybe they're worthy of thinking about aside from his character. So that's what we're going to do now. So the first, the being in time, at least the selections that we're looking at, begin with he says, so what I'm doing here is asking the question, what is the meaning of being? What is being? And I already said that there's already some language problems here because we're using the isness of isness. What's the isness of isness? So we're using being in the question about being. What is being? Does is have a different being than the being that we're asking about? You see, there's like already, there's something complicated here where one might have not noticed before. And he says the same question that's been asked by Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, all the philosophers all the way through. The problem is, and again, in a typical German fashion, everybody up until me has had this one problem. They had turned being into a thing. So they've understood the meaning of being or the being of being as a thing. For Plato, it's the forms or the good. For Aristotle, it is, again, the forms or the unmoved mover. In Descartes, I'm a thinking thing, right? And God's thingness is a different kind of thingness, so not really the same kind of thingness, but God is a thing in the sense that it is that which assures the truth of this thing. So everything's a thing. There's thinking things and res extentia and res cogitans. Res is thing and cogitan is thinking. Res extension, res extentia, extended things, body and mind, two things. Kant, the functions of consciousness, the categories of consciousness, the faculties of consciousness become the thing that is the source of being. Yeah, not even source. Just the arbiter of it, right? And so much so that Kant asked this question: what is being in the sense of what is? That is there is just a conjunction, a connector, right? So all of it happens because of the power of the mind. Now, okay, I think that Heidegger might skim across some interesting things said by some of them. Some of these philosophers, but we're not here to evaluate whether or not he's got the history of philosophy right. Let's just grant him what he says. And there's something to it. Everybody in philosophy hitherto has understood like the source of being as a sort of constructing power. What are the forms? The forms are the things that make this reality. What is the unmoved mover? It is the actuality towards which the potential moves, right? It's the source of being. What is consciousness in Descartes? The source of truth and judgment. Same in Kant and so forth and so forth and so forth, right? So it's the source of meaning and the source of being is a thing, right? So this becomes problematic because being is understood as a thing. We're going to see that this is problematic because for Heidegger and the phenomenologists, thingness is secondary to a totality. There is first and foremost a unity of things and world, and from that unity, single things can show up. So it is not that single things make up the unity of the world. That's been the assumption. And the unity of the world cannot be gotten to by an amalgam. It's not experienced that way. I don't add each new experience into my unity and like, oh, this fits in too. Oh, this fits in too. Oh, this fits in too. There's never even a question. I live my life as if this world is a whole. The philosophers and the scientists have understood it as if it is a collection of individual bits. So we got to get past that. So what does he say? He says that this is Heideggerianese, okay? The philosophers have never asked about the thingly nature of a thing, right? How are things thingly? And you've seen me. I've put that mark on the whiteboard before and said, "How is that there?" Remember, and what the philosophers and everybody has done is gone straight to the mark and tried to understand that mark as if it was there on its own. And the phenomenologist is going to say, not only is that mark there because of the board, but it's also there because of me and the board and the mark all at once. That whole thing is a unity. We start talking about the mark by way of abstracting that one thing out of the whole world. So they never ask the thingly nature of a thing. They begin with an abstract thing in general. Kant says this. The most basic understanding I can have of a thing is thing here now. Thing here now. Like a placeholder, a variable. I have like a blank slate for thing to show up, any old thing. And that's like the most basic engagement is like a placeholder for thing. The philosophers have thought of the world from the standpoint of not living in it. And we've talked about this already. They privilege only one way of being in the world. This is what we're going to have to deal with. Being in the world is, for Heidegger, huge. Like, when you shut this down after a little bit and say to yourself, being in the world, being in the world, being in the world, 50 times, because you need to have that word in your vocabulary to do anything about Heidegger. And being in the world is like one word. In German, it's ein der Welt sein. Ein der Welt sein, one word. In translation, that's usually hyphenated, being dash in dash the dash world, so that you don't think of it as a separate stuff. Being in the world. So the philosophers and scientists have understood being in the world from a place out of the world. Understand experience from a place that is not experience. They have all taken the world as something like a thing independent of us. So, Merleau-Ponty's great on this. Heidegger's getting at it too, but he doesn't do the same thing. All of history has started with this, like, as the second sentence in their philosophy. Of course, that's overstated, but there is a difference between mind and body. There's an absolute difference between mind and body, I say, from the beginning. And then they spend their entire careers trying to get mind and body back together, which is like silly, because once you start off with an absolute distinction, you're never going to get them back together. And one of the questions is, why do you start with the distinction? I do not experience my world as if I am two things. I don't say, I wonder if my body could walk to over there. I don't walk through the world thinking about walking through the world. When I try to walk, I do so poorly. And I'm like trying, if I don't even know how to do it. Like, it's only when there's a problem, like if I got a pain or a limp or something, that I have to like try to walk. is walking in an effort for consciousness. So I deploy my power. So why do I start with this thing that, well, I'm two things? This is to start with the subject-object dualism too. So all of philosophy has hitherto started from the wrong place to understand the unity of everything. How does everything, what is the nature of being? Well, let's start by dicing it all up, and then we can figure out how it was a unity. Phenomenology wants to take a different stance. So that's the next bit.